Good morning. My name is Danny Platz. It's a real pleasure to meet you today, although it's only virtually. I regret that I cannot be there in person. The topic of my presentation is infrastructure asset management. It's something that is not entirely new, but the way the UN and UNDESA has approached it is somewhat new because what we're really trying to do is bring a topic that is very much known to the private sector, to corporations, to companies, the topic of asset management, to bring that to the public sector as a new organizational practice, a new organizational discipline. So my presentation today is about that, and hopefully it is at least something that sparks your interest and convinces you to some degree that infrastructure asset management can be an important tool to localize the SDGs. If we get you interested in what the UN has to offer in our tools, in our guides, all of them freely available, then I'll be very, very happy at the end of this presentation. We saw something historic happening on infrastructure asset management this year at the Sevilla Conference on Financing for Development. There, for the first time, the UN committed to support national local governments on infrastructure asset management. There's never been a reference before to the term infrastructure asset management in an official UN resolution. So that now there's a global consensus that this is of utmost importance. And so this effort and this interest comes at a very timely point in time. If you translate this somewhat convoluted mandate of the UN, you would just say, we need to manage what we build, otherwise we'll waste what we invest. So that's a shorter way of expressing that mandate. It means that we have to do a better job at making sure what we already have in place is more sustainable and resilient and serves our current future generations. And what we will invest in terms of future infrastructure is also done so in a way that it will last for a long time. So this idea of infrastructure asset management is exactly that. There are some numbers that should convince you, if you're not already convinced, that it is an important issue, even before I really explain what we at the UN understand when we talk about infrastructure asset management. Over 90% of the SDGs are linked directly or indirectly to infrastructure. We know that under-maintained infrastructure can lead to an annual 2% loss in GDP growth. Something I did not know before I got into this topic was that up to 85% of life cycle costs occur after the construction phase. So infrastructure asset management is a huge issue in development finance. It's not just about the finance needed for the construction acquisition. It's about the finance needed to operate, maintain it, and even dispose of it later on, in addition to the acquisition and construction phase. So it's a huge issue for development finance. Every dollar spent on infrastructure maintenance is as effective as $1.50 of new investments. That's based on OECD studies. I personally believe they're quite conservative, and I think it could be even higher than that, especially when we consider the impact of climate change, like depicted in the picture above. So what do we understand with the term infrastructure asset management? What do we mean by it? There's no one definition. When we approach it at the UN as a capacity development initiative, we focus on physical things of value that are essential to the delivery of basic public services and that are owned or managed by the local or central government. So this is really about empowering the public sector to manage the infrastructure it is responsible for better. It is not about PPPs, a very important topic, public-private partnerships and so forth. It is more about those cases where infrastructure is managed publicly and what the public sector can do to manage it even better. So what is managing infrastructure assets? It is really the coordinated series of activities that monitor and maintain these things of value. And what are those things of value? They include infrastructure, typical infrastructure we think of, like roads, water and sanitation, energy grids, railroads, and so forth, waste management facilities. A lot of those are still in public hands and will be in public hands for a long time to come. So that's what we look at. But then we also look at the equipment that often goes with this infrastructure. When you think about waste management, a landfill is not enough. You need vehicles and garbage collection trucks, right? So that equipment, these are also assets that have to be managed. They're physical things of value. Buildings house soft infrastructure, public buildings like hospitals, schools, but even town halls. Those are important to manage as well. And then we have natural resources, some of which fulfill the function of infrastructure. You can build a retaining wall to protect yourself from flooding, or in some cases, if you're near a coastline, you can invest into building mangrove forests. Both of them, and maybe even arguably the natural asset, maybe even more effective. So you need to manage your natural assets as well. What is the goal? The goal is to maximize the service value of public infrastructure investments and leverage them to finance sustainable development for generations to come. And now coming back to what we have to offer, why is DESA's contribution adding value here? Well, DESA really published the first global guidebook on infrastructure asset management for local governments. And that guidebook introduces IAM, as we call infrastructure asset management in short, as a public sector duty. It positions it as a team exercise driving organizational change. And it spans engineering, finance, and procurement and other disciplines. There are common challenges we have to recognize when we talk about asset management. And let me get out of the way a little bit so you see it here as well. So we have the big question of the new and shiny versus the old and lasting. So the biggest challenge in asset management is really to convince the public sector to put money aside now, invest money in maintenance rather into the new projects in certain cases to make sure that things last longer and don't break down. There's always scarcity of resources, but it's always more attractive to invest into the new and shiny. So we need to think about also investing into the old and lasting. And when we invest into the new and shiny, to put sufficient resources aside to make sure we can upkeep it. There's a management mindset challenge where asset management is not really seen as a multidisciplinary effort yet. It's often left to the financial accountants to just sort of keep track of the value of assets, and then to the engineers that need to run into the field if something breaks down. There are budget disconnects where we have a capital budget that is very ambitious, but not a lot of provisions for the operational budget to run the assets. There's governance fragmentation, where assets are managed by many different parties and no one really knows who's responsible. And there are data gaps. We don't have all the information we need. And infrastructure asset management tackles all of these areas. And I will not be able to talk about all of them today, but we'll touch on some very basic concepts that give you an idea of how we think about meeting these challenges. So more than anything, infrastructure asset management is about thinking strategically. You have many infrastructure assets as a public sector entity, where even if you're just managing one asset, say you're the National Road Authority, you still have many sub-assets in that class. And you need to take tough decisions within limited resources as to when to do what. And that's what asset management is about. It's not just maintenance, it's strategic thinking for the systems that hold up our societies. It's about timing, resources, and smart decisions that keep things working for everyone. What do we have to offer concretely? Quite a few tools. I will again move to the to the side here, so you can actually, a little awkward, you can scan that barcode here and actually get the handbook and download it. But we'll send you the presentation as well. So if you can't do it now and I'm in your way, you can do it later. It's freely available. And that handbook has many tools on diagnostics, action plans, building data asset registries, doing climate vulnerability assessments. It's a free tool now available in 11 languages, and I recommend that you all take a look. It's really easy to read. It's a big book, but it's not a 400-page textbook. It's designed for easy use. It's specifically written for local government officials. Freely available in 11 languages, including all 6 UN languages. So please check it out. And before we dive deeper into the substance, just want to make sure you have access to these resources and you know that you're there. If you feel lost in the presentation, I hope you won't. But if you do, you know, this is all drawing on this handbook and you can go back to it, and it's probably much better explained in there than I will do it now. We have, based on this handbook, introduced this discipline to many governments around the world, resulting in real policy shifts, stronger budgets, and smarter service delivery. Over 220 local governments have launched these asset management action plans that are based on the handbook toolkits, and over 4,500 government officials have been trained. So let's move now to the first section where we talk about personal asset management and public asset management. And it's a good way to learn about asset management in a very relatable way. So we all own or manage personal assets or things of value for a reason, right? We do need personal things of value for a reason. We need shelter, we need food, we need transportation. What assets correspond to that? If you think about shelter, house, apartments provide shelter. Food, we do need cooking equipment for. Transportation, we need cars, motorcycles, bicycles, and so forth. So we have assets for a reason, because they meet very, very basic needs. I want to now stop here and have you think a little bit about what you can learn from your own personal assets in terms of what asset management means and entails. So I will ask the facilitator to stop the recording here, pause it, and have a little break for discussion and ask the following questions. What information are you collecting and updating about your car to make sure you get the most out of your car? And second, do you feel you have the information that you think you need? So please stop right here and go into the discussion. Great. Now that you had a discussion on this issue, I'm sure you had many ideas and many types of information that were referenced that you need to manage your car. And when we do asset management, we usually think about 6 broad questions that help us wrap our head around the information we need for each asset. So when you think about your car, of course, you need to know that it is a car, and you need to know where it is, right? A car is useless if you don't know where it is. We all had the situation when probably we parked it at a parking lot somewhere and we had trouble finding it. It's very disconcerting, right? You need to know where your car is. You need to know what it's worth, right? How much did you pay for it? And if you had to sell it, how much would it be worth now? And that also helps you take decisions on whether to buy a new car or invest into the old one. You need to know what its condition is. When was the last time it was in a repair shop? What's working, what is not working? Do you have maintenance records, right? You need to know its condition more than like whether it's working or not. You need to know what it can do. What are its performance measures? Is it a car that you can take out on a field road? Is it a car that you can still load fully and drive as fast as you can? Do you have to be a bit more careful with it? You need to know what type of car you're having, right? You need to know what its remaining service life is, or at least have an estimate, so you can plan when you need a new car. What is its deferred maintenance? Very important. What needs to be done that you haven't done yet? We all, I think, are in the same boat, that there are always things you can do to your assets, whether it's a car or your house, to improve it. You can't afford everything, but you need to know what you have done so far and what still needs to be done. So deferred maintenance is an important aspect. And then you need to take a decision. What should you fix first? Within that asset, do you have to do the oil change now or the tire rotation? Do you have to have a general checkup? And also among different assets. If you have a house and you have a car, should you repaint the wall first, invest in that, or should you bring the car to the repair shop? So these are complex questions that arise from these simple questions. And these 6 fundamental questions of IAM you will find everywhere where asset management is taught. And as you embrace asset management as a public sector team, these can be very, very, very helpful guideposts. So please remember those. Now let's move from personal to public assets. Every asset that you have, or almost every asset that you have, relies on a public asset. If you have a laptop or even textbooks, that's great. But as an educational resource, they are only useful if you actually have a school that is a public asset, right? If you have a private car, you need a road to drive it on. If you have a private toilet or shower, you need a sewage treatment plant, right? So your personal assets depend and are connected to public assets. So to close this section, let's remember we are all asset managers already because we have personal assets. You are an asset manager. In our personal lives, we carefully manage homes, cars, savings, and belongings. But this same commitment we don't see yet in many cities or local governments. What you were thinking about in terms of collecting all the information you need to manage your cars or personal assets well, these types of information and data points we need too for our public assets, but often we don't have them. Imagine if roads, schools, water systems, hospitals were cared for with the same dedication we give our own property. That would be nice, right? And that's the idea of asset management, to change the mindset to get to this point. So let me move on to section 2 on infrastructure asset management as a public sector practice. Quickly, again, what is it? Why do we do it? And who does it? So we already talked about what infrastructure asset management is in a more academic way. It's the coordinated series of activities to monitor and maintain things of value. But there's a much simpler definition that I like much better, which is we need to have the right assets in the right place at the right time, managed by the right people. We talked about the assets, infrastructure assets, classical assets, equipment that belong to it, buildings, natural resources. Those need to be managed by the right people at the right time. And who are those people? Your team. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Let's do another quick break here for discussion. Why do you think do we need better infrastructure asset management at the local and national government levels? What are the benefits of infrastructure asset management? Well, you talked about some concrete benefits, and there are many. The ones I like to mention the most are, first and foremost, reliable public service delivery. If assets are managed well, they function. If water is tested frequently, it won't be contaminated. If pipes are repaired, there will be less leakages. If waste management is well organized, garbage will be picked up and not become a health hazard. So asset management is first and foremost about public service delivery. But there are huge financial savings if assets don't break down, and you do preventive maintenance instead of reactive maintenance. There's some estimates that costs are 25 times higher to fix an asset that breaks down on a regular basis compared to making sure you do all the maintenance you need. And you will not only save costs, but you will also have more revenue, because if there are user fees, more users will be able to use it. Plus, there are studies out there that people are more willing to pay taxes if they see their taxpayer money is put to good use. So tax compliance will increase as well, right? There's environmental sustainability, of course. I always joke that, when it comes to office furniture at the UN, we're very sustainable because we still have our desks from the 1960s and 1970s that are these old metal desks. They work just fine. They're ugly, but they work just fine. So if you have assets that last for a long time, by virtue of that, you're already protecting the environment, right? Because you're not investing into huge new construction. But also, if they run well, they don't break down, they don't leak, they don't pollute. So environmental sustainability is a huge component of infrastructure asset management. And then as you plan into new infrastructure, you take that into account as well, of course, making sure that over its lifespan, it's as environmentally friendly as it can be. It needs to be also disaster resilient. With climate change happening, that is a huge part of asset management, to adapt to climate change through maintenance, through upgrades, through smart planning. You have enhanced transparency if you manage assets. If your citizens see you managing that asset on a regular basis, it increases trust. And altogether, it increases community wealth. So when we talk about community wealth, we refer to the service value of the asset and the financial value. Physical infrastructure is the backbone of public service delivery, but also assets have a financial value. They cost money to acquire and generate funds when sold. Both of it contributes to the wealth of the community: financial, economic, social, and environmental. Now, who does infrastructure asset management? And that's one of the more important slides today. It is not the job of one department alone. Asset management requires input from multiple disciplines. Now, it's fantastic to have an asset management unit that can coordinate these disciplines. That's why asset management units are so important. I applaud every local government that thinks about introducing that. Often we have it at the national level to some degree, but we often don't have it at the local government level. But the asset management unit will not be able to work alone. It will have to work with leadership and governance, with finance, with engineering, with procurement, with community engagement and communications, with operations and maintenance teams. So it's really all about making sure that it works only if we approach it as a team effort. It is about organizational change and instilling a new culture. And infrastructure asset management really belongs to the whole organization. So let's look at section 3 and introduce infrastructure asset management more academically, if you will, or more as a established practice. When we talk about asset management, and it's been a field that's been around, guided by industrial standards for at least 15 years now, mostly, again, more at the sort of corporate level. Then we think about 3 pillars usually. Those 3 pillars are demand management, life cycle management, and financial management. So when it comes to demand management, that means we need to understand the demand placed on our infrastructure from current generations, future generations, through the service required, but also through regulations we have to meet. When we talk about life cycle management, really think about what we need to do to make sure we take the right decision over the life cycle of an asset. We look at it also across many different assets. We understand the risks for that. And the life cycle management has to be also tied into the capital improvement plan that the city has. What are the big improvements you're planning for, and how do they relate to the assets that I have already? Financial management is really about how we can afford our asset management interventions, and also taking very careful decisions as to what are the benefits of the intervention, what are the costs, when to do what. So we have to understand demand, we have to understand the life cycle of an asset, and we have to understand the finances needed for it. So these are the three pillars that are usually part of this asset management approach, and we'll dive a little deeper, especially into lifecycle management and portfolio management today. So I'd like to take another quick break here and ask the facilitator to ask this question. What are the different phases of an asset life cycle in your experience, and how do they differ in terms of their importance and costliness? So first, the question would be, when you think about a life cycle of an asset, what do we mean by that? What is the entire life cycle of an asset? What are the different phases? And then if you compare those different phases, which ones are more important than others? Which ones are more expensive than others? So here's a chart that maybe would have facilitated the discussion a little bit, but for effect, I'm showing it now. It's a typical life cycle management chart of assets that shows you the different phases, and it shows you the costs over time. So here you can already see the different phases: plan, acquire, use, and dispose have very different time spans and very different costs associated with it, right? So this is obviously not very precise, right? But the message we're trying to bring here is that costs that are tied to asset management change drastically over time, and they accumulate over time. And each phase has a completely different profile, and we'll talk about each phase a bit more in detail. So what is also important to understand is that each phase of an asset's life cycle, planning, acquiring, using, and disposing, comes with many, many important questions that we as a team, as a city team, have to ask ourselves. For the planning, we need to know, what do we need? What rules do we follow? For the acquisition construction, we need to know, how do we get them? How will we pay for them? How do we build them? For the use phase, we need to know, how do we look after them? When and where will we look after them? And then dispose phase is about what happens when we don't need them anymore. How do we get rid of our assets? Now, sometimes people don't really believe this at first, right? But the planning phase is really the most important one of all of them. Even before you build anything, you really, really, really need to plan well, because you are stuck with that asset for sometimes 50 years if you don't do it well, right? Life cycles of assets are vastly different, but some of them have a very long life cycle, right? So the consequences of bad planning will be with you for current and future generations. So take your time planning. And our point as instructors of infrastructure asset management is to make sure that that planning phase is not just looking at the acquisition and the use in the next 3 to 5 years, but it's really looking at the entire life cycle of the asset. You have to plan for sufficient flexibility. You have to think about the right strategy to make sure that the asset can serve current and future generations. So the planning phase is the most important, but the least expensive one. So all the more reason to take your time with it. So what are some of the planning questions we need to ask as asset managers? Well, purpose and its users. Why do we need it? What service, for how long, and who uses it? The cost and affordability. Can we afford the life cycle costs? Not just the acquisition cost, but as a city, can we sustain the asset? And what will be the funding sources? Is it user fees? Is it general revenue as a city? Are these fiscal transfers that are coming from the government? Where do you get the money to fund the operations? The delivery capacity, how will we acquire, operate, and maintain it? Do we have the people skills? And I should also add the material to maintain it. Okay. If you don't have the material and the skills in place, it may not be the right asset to buy or acquire. Dependencies and end of life cycle considerations. How do we dispose of it safely? And what happens to other assets if we dispose of it? We also need to look at regulations when we plan. National asset management in particular, and our own organizational policy strategies and plans. We need to make sure we follow all of them. So what does that look like concretely? For example, you're planning a new landfill. You have to ask yourself questions at different levels. We often talk about strategic, tactical, and operational levels. It's a sort of military, typical military terminology, but it also applies to asset management. And think of it as, perhaps operational 2 years, tactical 2 to 5 years, and then strategic 5 to 15 years. So think about it as short, medium, and long term. So strategically, we need to make sure that we very much take very careful decisions as to where we place it, follow all the regulations, consulting the local community, right? So these are strategic considerations. Tactical considerations. We need to understand what type of landfill, what service options we have with the local community, discuss different types of collection with community. Right? And then operational, when we build it, what is the immediate design of the landfill? What type of vehicles do we need to buy? So think of it when you plan in terms of your operational, tactical, and strategic needs. Now let's move to the next phase, the acquisition phase. This is the shortest phase. Now, if you need to build an asset, it can be quite long, right? Yes, but it shouldn't take more than, let's say, 3 to 5 years, even for more complex assets. But it is usually the shortest phase, especially if we're just talking about acquisition of things like let's say, we're buying a new building that already exists. We're buying new vehicles for our garbage collection. But initially, it's a very expensive. It's not the most expensive one, but it's a very expensive initial investment. So for the first 5 to 10 years, this is a huge sum of money you will invest, right? So you need to take that into account. So let's break here for a second again, and please think about this question. What are the key questions we need to ask ourselves as public asset managers during the construction and acquisition phase of an asset? Okay, so here are some considerations, and there are many more. When we acquire an asset, we need to be aware, of course, of the relevant legislation, policies, directives, and standards. We need to follow certain procurement processes. We need to be very, very clear that what we acquire provides the services needed and targets the right clientele, right? And all of them. As a public sector, we have a mission to serve all of our community. So we need to make sure that what we buy doesn't discriminate, serves people with disabilities, serves minorities. Should we build, purchase, lease, renovate, or expand on existing assets? And sometimes, again, you may not have to buy something completely new. You can expand. You can lease. What are the risks associated with the construction phase? That often comes with environmental risk, with service disruptions, with hazards. We need to think of those risks. What are other non-financial costs associated with the construction phase, and what other assets are affected or linked? So especially when we think about non-financial costs, we should be very careful thinking through all of them. So the social costs I mentioned already of acquisition of new assets and construction are often traffic delays, service disruptions, unequal impact, reduced accessibility. Think about a road that has to be blocked or a hospital that is not operational. Waste management that may be affected as you upgrade your fleet and sell the old. There are economic costs, not only a business loss because of service disruptions, but also property damage sometimes. Constructions can be quite messy. And then there's environmental stuff to consider, of course, contamination, pollution, public health impacts. So these are all the careful considerations to be made during the acquisition phase. Now let's move to the longest and, surprisingly, most expensive phase of the asset life cycle, and that is the use phase. So I mentioned that earlier on, that 85% of an asset's costs are happening here in this phase and in the disposal phase. So we need to be very, very careful about financing, having financing strategies in place to fund that phase, right? A key, and I haven't mentioned that enough yet, a key foundation for all of asset management, but especially for the use phase, is our asset register or asset registry. We've done this around the world for a while now, these training workshops and also these field visits. And we've seen that when we go to cities, they often have asset registries in place. And then we ask to take a look, and often they are just limited to certain things like furniture, equipment, computers, sometimes vehicles. They do not include the public infrastructure that is managed, like roads, parks, cemeteries, waste management facilities. It doesn't mean that the information is not there. There may be a line department that has some information, right, on the waste management vehicle fleet. There is the road authority. But there's rarely an information system in place that gives the city or even the national government an overview of the assets it owns, where they are, what conditions they're in, what value they have, and so forth. And you need that to make smart decisions about maintenance and management. So a lot of what we do is helping countries, helping local governments build these asset registries. So they meet not only accounting standard accounting guidelines, right, but they also meet actually a criteria for good asset management. So here are some, things that people put into a word cloud in previous trainings. What in terms of what type of information they think is important to collect when you have assets. So building an asset registry is key. And what can be done quickly sometimes is the city just sitting together with all its different departments and just consolidating data or thinking about how data can be consolidated in an Excel spreadsheet. So, maybe every 6 months or so, you come together between your different public works departments and see if there's some key data you can actually put together so that you can get a bird's eye perspective. Keep in mind that during the use phase that you're looking at assets with very different service line, right? Natural assets don't have a set service line. Water and sanitation sometimes has a service life of 50 years or more. Computers may only have 3 years, right? So that's why it's so important to think about this as something that is instilled into the culture of a local government, because some assets will really be the work and the daily duty of generations of asset managers, not just one. There might be a turnover. Whereas, if you have an asset like a personal computer, it's a little easier to manage. You train one person, and that person perhaps stays with that computer for 3 years, although it's a public computer. It knows what to do to keep it in good shape. It does the regular updates. It treats it well, right? But if you're looking at assets that last 40, 50 years or longer, you need to have a culture, a policy in place in your local government that passes on good asset management practice from one team to another. You need to, when doing the use considerations, doing the use phase of an asset, you need to have these considerations in mind. Demand and supply changes. City grows, priorities change, and the ability of the asset to meet that changes. So you need to adjust your maintenance needs and maintenance interventions according to that. That means also the levels of services need to be adjusted. Often they need to become more ambitious. Sometimes they may go down, but often it means during a use and operation phase of an asset, you really have to adjust the levels of service again because your city has grown, the needs have grown. You really have to understand that to understand operations and maintenance need. And you need to make sure you have the financing in place to do so. Right? Then we go back to the planning phase. We have to make sure that the operational costs will be covered. Asset performance must be monitored and ensured through preventive maintenance. Right? That is the goal. We don't want to have reactive maintenance where we wait until something breaks down and fix it then. Preventive maintenance is the key. And I mentioned earlier that there are some estimates that you can really multiply costs by 25 if you don't do it well, right? So let us stop here again for a quick discussion on this idea of how do we know an infrastructure asset is performing well during its use phase? Can you share a concrete example from your own experience? So as we are in the use and operation phase, we need to really monitor our assets well to understand what we need to do to better manage them, to maintain them. What interventions do they need? But how do we manage it? So pick one asset, pick one type of infrastructure, and think about how its performance is managed in your local government. Thank you. So I pick water, for example, right? So there are technical attributes and performance measures for water. Its reliability, how many breaks are tolerable, how many service disruptions are tolerable, its availability, what is the yield per person, how many boreholes per person, how many wells, if it's not piped water, compliance with regulatory requirements. And all of that then has to be measured against a target, right? And then we see an actual and a target, and we see what we need to do in terms of our maintenance and interventions to get to that target. But besides the technical attributes, do not forget the customer-based attributes and performance measures. You need to be able to respond to customer complaints and demands. Right? They're at the forefront of where the asset is used. They can tell you sometimes more than your technical measurement devices. Right? You need to make sure your assets, your boreholes are accessible. You need to make sure they're safe, especially for women who often, in terms of boreholes, do the bulk of the work of collecting water. So preventive management is really, really key. And for that, we have this what I mentioned earlier again here. You have preventive maintenance as one option. You can do corrective maintenance, which is sort of, something is really getting into bad shape but not yet breaking down. You're already increasing costs 5 times. And reactive maintenance is 25 times as expensive. So this is not just fantasy. So these are numbers from the Institute of Asset Management, International Institute, that has looked at study after study of the cost of not doing preventive maintenance, but only doing reactive maintenance. So infrastructure asset management is a huge cost saver in the long run. When you assess whether you do an intervention or not, right? You need to look at risk. And what is risk? Think of an asset-related event that you want to avoid. For example, a borehole will run dry, right? So when you think about risk, you always think about two things: the likelihood of that happening times the consequence of failure. And that consequence of failure in our experience is often not considered enough. Likelihoods are sometimes better understood, or you can say, okay, it's very unlikely that this or that will happen, so we don't worry about it. But if the implications of failure are so large that they pose a threat to the community, then you do need to consider it, then the risk will go up. So carefully, and we have matrices and tools that can help you evaluate these risks for your different assets. And then you can rank them, and you can think about where the risks are highest, and that helps you to decide what to do first within an asset class, but also across different assets like road and water and waste management and so forth. Now let's come to the last phase, which is the dispose phase of an asset, right? So once an asset is done, expired, doesn't serve its use anymore, that can be after 3 years, can be after 50 years. You need to somehow get rid of it or decommission it. If you have a well-kept truck you don't need anymore, it can be repurposed and it can be sold. Can generate a revenue. But if you have a landfill that you need to decommission, that costs a lot of money. So keep that disposal phase in mind as you invest into new assets. If you don't, you may end up with hidden costs you can't deal with and cope with later on. Disposal considerations, when do you dispose of an asset, include: is there still demand for that asset? Even though it looks decrepit, is it still being used? Perhaps it is not time to dispose of it yet, but rather fix it. Is it still performing or not? And then once you make the decision, do you want to sell it or do you want to transfer it? Is there use for that asset in another local government or another entity of your organization? As you dispose of an asset, you have to also follow a process. You have to make sure you preserve local heritage. Some assets you can't just get rid of, right? You need to get an appraisal to make sure you get a fair market price when you auction it off. You need to consult your community, interested parties. You need to meet legal obligations, and you need to protect the environment. So quite complex, each of these phases we've been through in the life cycle. And there's more to it, and we have tools to understand these phases better. Finally, this is the last section we want to talk about today: systems-based asset management. It's so important, but it can really only be properly understood when you talk about life cycle first. Systems-based management is this idea, and we've alluded to it a few times. It's this idea of continuously looking at how you prioritize your interventions across different infrastructure assets. So you want to make sure you prioritize in the right way. You want to make sure you optimize your interventions. At the strategic level, the long-term level, you need to find the best mix of assets for your local government. What infrastructure do you really need and how it all works together? At the tactical level, in the shorter term, you need to find the best sequences of life cycle interventions to maximize benefits and minimize costs. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit more. So a lot of it is about sequencing, right? You need to make sure that in the order of your interventions across different infrastructure makes sense, that optimizes the capital and resources you have and maximizes long-term service value. And that can have a huge service impact and a huge financial impact. So let's again have a quick discussion and ask this question. Can you think of an example of systems-based asset management where sequencing of maintenance decision had a decisive impact? So it should say sequencing of maintenance decisions here in this slide. So can you think of an asset, whether it's road or waste management or electricity or anything of that nature? Can you think of an asset where maintenance, repair decisions are important to be sequenced in the right way. So where it really makes sense to look at the order in which you do things. And you can look at one asset or more than one asset. This is a tricky question. It's not so easy. But perhaps a best way to think about it is to look at assets that are close to each other, that are built on top of each other. Okay, so here's a very classical example of system-space management, keeping a bird's eye view. So there's a challenge. You need a maintenance for your road and your water pipes. Okay, system-space asset management would conduct the road and water pipe repair together, right? But you can only do that if you know exactly when and where you need to do these repairs, right? You need to know your water pipe's condition. You need to know when repairs due. You need to know your road condition. You need to know when repairs due. And then you see overlaps and you know, oh, okay, I can do this by only digging once. If you do it in a siloed way, if you don't have all that data and you don't do that thinking, right? You do the road repair and then something happens with your water pipe. It breaks down. You haven't done the preventive maintenance. You haven't done your repair. It breaks down. You need to tear up the road again. Costs multiply. So the dig once policy is a critical policy for assets that are stacked on top of each other, and a great example for system-based management, but there's of course more. So when you look at the planning level, right, you need to really look at all plan needed interventions, assess them collectively, then conduct your repairs, and then record those interventions to guide future systems-based decisions. There are systems-based decisions that are very tricky. For example, you may want to consider turning certain assets into other assets, like land, a physical asset, could become a financial asset. You can sell it in order to finance an intervention elsewhere, like the upgrade of solid waste collection or building a new school. If you do that with land, though, it's a one-time action that you can't do again, right? So some of these, especially if they involve land, some of these trade-offs between system-based interventions are quite serious and need to be considered carefully. So system-based intervention is managing assets collectively, but also understanding the trade-offs of asset interventions and how they relate to each other. It's a very complex discipline. And if you think back to the life cycle that I showed you, the planning, the acquisition, the use, and the disposal, think of every asset's needs across that entire life cycle, operating maintenance needs, right? They're so complex, and each asset class has sub-asset classes and so forth. And then you have many of those assets. And so how do you optimize all these different interventions? You know, in order to be perfect, you have to use a supercomputer, really. It gets that complicated. But we're not asking anyone to be perfect. We're asking them to look at the very obvious interventions that are in the near time horizon in the next 2 years, and just make sure you know them in terms of the preventive maintenance you're doing. And when you're digging up that road to repave it, take a look at the pipe underneath, perhaps see if it needs anything, right? Or if you know it needs repair, do it exactly then. So these are, you know, key issues of systems-based management, sometimes also referred to as portfolio-based management. So I'm done. Thank you so much for your attention. I have 2 more slides though, or maybe 3, but they're very short and they're just recap slides. So if there's 2 things I want you to remember, it's what is asset management? It is having the right assets at the right place at the right time, managed by the right people, and let's add with the right tools. So this simple definition of asset management hopefully will stay with you. I mentioned it a few times. And I mentioned those 6 fundamental questions earlier. So if you remember the 6 questions and the definition of asset management, that's already more than I could ask for. Try to remember these questions and see how many, as you go back to your cities or local governments and even the national government, how many of these questions can you answer at any point of time for all of your assets? What can you do better to get the responses? That gives you the idea of how to do asset management and also who to involve in your asset management team. I want you to think of creating an asset management, a group of friends of asset management, perhaps. If you don't have the resources to start a new department or a new unit, start with a group of friends of asset management champions from engineering, from finance, from procurement. They can be at the technical level. As long as you believe in asset management, it's good. Meet regularly once a month, every 3 months to think about these questions across your entire asset portfolio. That could be a great first step. So please stay in touch. Thank you so much for listening. We will send you this presentation without me blocking everything. And then you can again look at the barcode and scan it. But I can also just turn off my camera for a second. So you can do so now. And use those resources. Feel free to email me. Let us know if your city, Sierra Leone in general, is interested in this effort. So thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.